Andrew did his PhD at Durham University on early military structures in Scotland, and he has affiliations with the University of Edinburgh and Higher Education Academy. He is particularly interested in using remote sensing and LiDAR to explore Iron Age and Romano British landscapes, and in engaging with the widest range of audience to share his passion for all things Roman and military.
Thank you very much for having me here tonight, and all those lucky people at home who can't actually see me. You don't know how lucky you are. So I'm Dr. Andrew Tibbs. I'm an honorary research fellow at Durham University. Tonight, I'm going to be talking to you a bit about some of my latest research, which is about Roman military sites in Scotland, particularly first century fortifications. I'm also going to talk a bit about how that data is gathered using big data. It's not a term to be scared of. It's just a fancy way of saying I did lots of work on this. I'll come back to Ardagh later, but I just thought that's a great slide to start with. It's a first century fortification. It's probably the best preserved in Scotland. You can see all the defences there, reoccupied in the 2nd century and cut down. And I will just give a plug that it's going to be on BBC Today programme in a couple of weeks. We were out filming last week, and they've got the drone going over, and you can see a lot of the ditches, and it really looks beautiful. So let's say tonight I'm going to talk about my 2020 PhD that I did under Richard Hingley at Durham, and that research focused really on the placement of Roman fortifications in the landscape and their relationship with the surrounding environment. So why they're building forts, where they're building them. In summary, I looked in some detail at 300 of the known and suspected sites in Scotland. That actually, I went on to produce that book there, Beyond the Empire, which looks at all the Roman sites in Scotland. But for the PhD, I had to narrow down the focus, and I looked at first century sites. And there's around 120 of those, although the data sets for that analysis are much larger, and I'll come back to that shortly. The data sets were put into what we call a GIS piece of software, Geographic Information Systems. Essentially, the very sort of simple explanation for that is that it's a database software that does analysis, but it lets you put sites in a spatial and a temporal context. So you can start to layer it up by time. You can pinpoint it down to very precise accuracy. I'll look at the various conclusions I sort of came to later on in this talk, but basically the results, the very basic line, the results said that Roman fortifications were placed in the landscape in positions that let them control the local population. Sometimes they're in strategic locations, such as protecting river crossings, but invariably they were constructed at the entrance to valleys, where valleys converge, or in some instances, overlooking valleys. And there's partly a psychological element to that, bearing in mind that the indigenous population at this time have never seen Roman soldiers looking fairly similar, wearing metal armor. They won't have seen big formal constructions such as Roman forts or Roman camps before. They'll have seen hill forts up in the hills. They won't have seen anything like this. So the Romans are coming in and trying to intimidate them. But also by positioning them by the valleys, the population can be managed. So essentially, wherever indigenous people are and they're moving through the landscape, they will eventually come to a Roman fortification, at the very least a Roman patrol from one of those fortifications. So the Romans are able to tax them, manage the population, basically do what they want with them, take what they want. At this point, I often say to people, think of the horrible things that are happening in war zones at the moment, like Ukraine, Afghanistan, things, the war crimes you hear, that was happening in this country 2,000 years ago. The Romans were an occupying force. They could do what they want, and people really couldn't stop them. The study I've been doing, it's had very similar conclusions to what's studies that have happened elsewhere. in the Roman world, Wales, Spain, Judea, and the findings are very similar, that fortifications are there to control the population and occasionally control resources. Essentially, my thesis came to over 1,000 pages, 2 volumes. Lucky for me and for readers, lockdown came along and I was able to condense that into about 90 pages of this volume here on the right. And that goes into a lot more detail than I'll be able to tonight. So if you have questions, I can't answer them tonight. I advise getting that volume. It is an academic volume before you look at the price. So before I go into what the results and what I did, I always find it useful to tell people, give them a summary of what was happening in Roman Scotland or North Britannia as it was. Scotland, of course, doesn't come into being till around 1,000 years later, but the Romans are laying the foundation for what becomes the modern country. Anyway, Romans, there are 3 main invasions of Roman Scotland. There is some circumstantial evidence of early activity and possibly later activity in Scotland, but there are really, we think, 3 main invasions. The first happens during the rule of the Flavian emperors around 76 to 86 AD, possibly slightly later. I'll maybe come back to that in a moment. The next invasion came under the Emperor Antoninus Pius, 139 to 165 AD. Of course, he takes over from Hadrian, abandons Hadrian's wall, and basically replicates what Hadrian does in Scotland with the Antonine Wall. Third campaign comes under Septimius Severus in the 3rd century. That's a very different campaign. It is essentially genocide. The indigenous population are harassing the Romans, and the emperor decides to come to Britain, lands in possibly in Scotland, or travels overland in Scotland, and is basically intent on wiping out all opposition. There are other things going on at that point, but I won't go into them tonight. Tonight, we're going to focus on this chap here, Julius Gnaeus Agricola, who was the Roman governor in charge during that first invasion of Scotland. So a little bit on the dates. We know they come into Scotland around the mid-70s. We've got dendrochronological tree ring dating evidence from Carlisle that suggests the fort there was being, Carlisle, not Stanix, was being built around 72, 73 AD. And we've got evidence of them up into Scotland and forts a few years later. They seem to abandon Scotland in the 1st century. There's a little bit of debate depending on who you speak to, but it seems to be around the mid to late 80s in the north of Scotland because the coins dry up. I think the latest coins are around AD 86, so we know they seem to be withdrawing at that point. The great thing in Scotland is that we have a surviving Roman text which details the early campaign under Agricola. That text is called the Agricola, and it's written by Tacitus, got here over on the far end there. Tacitus, although, is his son-in-law. We know a little bit about his motivation. Tacitus was writing not a biography, not a history. He's writing to impress a particular audience in Rome. So his book is essentially a propaganda piece. But since its rediscovery in about the 16th century, 17th century, it's been a really influential text in interpreting Scotland. A lot of early sites in Scotland, a lot of the discovery of Roman sites in Scotland and before really the 20th century, a lot of those were automatically assumed to have been founded by Agricola because it says in the text that Agricola personally founded every Roman fort, which seems to be give you an idea of quite the boast, because of course there were units that went out and chose locations for forts and that. Interestingly, the Agricola has plenty of generic descriptions of battles on mountains, campaigns in North Britain, but the very bottom line is that could happen anywhere north of the Pennines. There's only, I think, two or three geographic locations mentioned in the Agricola. the Bodotria and the Clota, which are two described as two inlets or river mouths, often assumed to be the Forth Clyde, but of course could equally refer to the Solway Tyne line, particularly because the Tyne back then was much more estuary-like than it is today. I'm going to talk about big data and go into that a bit more in a second, but just want to show you how many first century sites we have in Scotland. There's, in this map here, there are 96 sites, but actually some of those sites have more than one fortification, quite often camps, sometimes other forts that seem to date from the same period. So we've got around 120 first century sites, and they go up as far north as Elgin, up in number 1, so quite near Inverness, which is behind the box there. I focused on first century for really 3 reasons. In Scotland, we've got a really great archive of archaeological data, historical data on Roman sites. We've got records of explorations of Roman sites as early as the 16th century. The second reason really is that the first century is the most extensive invasion of Scotland. Say they go up there up towards Elgin, but they're all across Scotland, as you can see there, because their intention probably was to occupy it and absorb it into the Roman Empire in time. Even though the text, the Agricola, has its flaws, it's still a historical, loose terms, historical account of what's happening in Roman Scotland. So it does help to tell a bit of the story about what's going on. Now, I want to talk about the types of fortifications we have in Scotland. So we got 5 different types. The first here is the Leedry Fortress at Inchtoodle in Perthshire. The red dotted line around there shows the size of it. It's very difficult to convey. Essentially, this is bigger than the Leedry Fortress at York. So York city centre would fit into this with a little bit of extra space. Think of this as the regional command headquarters in Scotland. Secondly, we have forts. There are 37 first century forts. These are essentially the local command centres. This is Birren's fort in Dumfries and Galloway. It's been fairly extensively excavated in the 20th century. We've got lovely ramparts and ditches that survive. And the interior, some of the interior buildings do show up in aerial photography. Forts in Scotland, more or less throughout the Roman invasions, are turf and timber construction. So turf ramparts, turf foundations with timber superstructures on top, which is why they tend to, in rural areas, survive slightly better because they're not ploughed out of existence. But here we have Birren's, which is one of the better preserved examples. The army also had camps. I'm sure everybody's heard of camps. I don't have an image of one tonight. These are secure enclosures that are surrounded with usually one ditch and rampart. They're usually described as being temporary. I would debate that. They're certainly there for a couple of days. The baggage train would have been, we think, possibly around 10 miles long. So bearing in mind, camps tend to be around 20 miles a day's march. You're always going to have someone coming behind you. We've got radiocarbon dating from Kintore camp up in Aberdeenshire that suggests that the occupation may have been, the camp may have been occupied for several weeks. We've also got Raydykes and a couple of other camps. Raydykes is also in Aberdeenshire, and that camp was surrounded by ditches cut from rock. So you're talking about 4 or 5 meters deep in the rock. So that doesn't really strike me as being a temporary construction. We've got 57 camps in Scotland that probably date to the 1st century. But it's very difficult to date them. Most of them aren't excavated. There's no scientific dating. Dating tends to be from finds and a couple of other methods that I'll come back to in a second. Next type of fortification we have are fortlets. This photo makes it look massive. It's not that big, but these are small forts, and they're usually guarding a particular resource. So it's a couple of small buildings, timber buildings, surrounded by a rampart and ditch with a single or sometimes a double entrance. They're guarding crossings, river crossings and roads. We also have towers. Now, this is from Germany. It's a reconstruction, potentially very similar to what's found in Scotland. We haven't got any evidence for a palisade, the wooden fence around it. Function of towers in Scotland, debated whether they're for signalling or they're acting as watchtowers. We have what appears to be two networks in Scotland, and I'll speak about those in a moment. So this is the big data bit, and I will be quick because it won't be that exciting for most people. But the data for my PhD came from a variety of resources, Canmore, Oasis, local historic environment records, and a whole host of other sources that are mentioned up there. Some of that data is recent, some of it is antiquarian. Antiquarian records, as I'm sure most people will know, can be a bit sketchy, but they can also be valuable little gold mines for sites that are lost or missed in more recent years. Some data is more readily available than others. Local historic environment records are quite difficult to access in Scotland. Very lucky in England, they're generally a lot more accessible. LiDAR, which is the new technique of laser scanning. This image down here on the right is generated from LiDAR, and it's satellite or plane laser scanning. Most of England has been done, only parts of Scotland have been done, and typically the Roman sites usually aren't covered by that data because it's not intended for Roman sites or archaeological sites. The mapping data as well comes from Ordnance Survey. Oh, and that is, sorry, I'm jumping ahead there. Yeah, the mapping survey from Ordnance Survey keeps being updated as well as they get better at taking the raw data and converting it into usable sources. As I say, all this information then goes in to a GIS. So the main source of archaeological data in Scotland for a project such as this is Canmore, and it's the national record of the historic environment, similar to Passgate in England, broadly similar. It has some flaws. It's not updated huge amounts once the basic data is there. Some of the data can be skewed through to manual errors when it's uploaded. And in terms of archaeological sites, it tends to give a single location point, which may not be in the right location quite often. So you can get a lot of data, but it does have its limitations, but it is a brilliant starting point. It has a brilliant bibliographic resource on it as well. This image here of Angus and Perthshire, so it's north of Edinburgh, has, you do initial search, you get 3,938 returns when you put Roman into that. However, that does include anything vaguely Roman, including Catholic churches. So you do have to do a lot of filtering, otherwise you find you're getting Roman sites in the middle of cities, which you don't expect sometimes. Sifting it and cleaning the data, as we say, gives you 2,677 entries, but that also includes Roman finds. So stray coins are recorded. So we have to take those out, and we can reduce it to 1,481 sites with possible or known associations with the Romans in terms of more structural things. So we take out the finds, but that includes Roman roads. It does include hordes, groups of finds in that. As I say, not every site is Roman in that 1,400 sites. Some of it can be antiquarian sites. The antiquarians had a habit of anything that looked vaguely interesting and labeling it as Roman. There's a lot of hill forts attributed to being Roman where they're nothing of the sort. So there's a lot of mislabeling, but it also includes crop marks that hint at Roman sites under the ground, but we haven't fully investigated to confirm that. So once you examine all that, you sift, you compile it, goes into a separate spreadsheet that has the initial coordinates. That gave me the 300 Roman sites in Scotland. But then we have to filter all that and find out what's likely to date to the 1st century. And as I've said before, there's 120 of those sites. This map shows around 150 possible Roman sites. It needs a lot of work to confirm those sites, and that's generally going to be on the ground practical work. Number 1 up here, I'll give you an example. That is a site called Bona on Loch Ness. It's assumed to be 2 small Roman forts which are square and next to each other. That's a pattern we don't really see. This is probably a medieval castle and associated features. But in order to confirm that, we need to get out on the ground and do geophysical survey. It doesn't work with LiDAR because there's not enough remains. A lot of the sites we have in Scotland are taken from antiquarian texts, as I mentioned, or from aerial photography. Huge aerial photography program in the 20th century in Scotland identified most of our sites. But again, a lot of those haven't been confirmed on the ground. So if we see a crop mark of two sides with a rounded corner, tends to indicate it could be Roman, but we need to get on the ground and check that out. And we've got, as I say, over 150 sites that we need to do that with. I just want to, there are issues with dating in Scotland. I just want to briefly mention some of those problems. So scientific dating is fairly secure. Radiocarbon dating, dendrochronology, tree ring dating, all that's great, but we only have very few sites in Scotland that have been investigated in recent years where we can apply those techniques. So we tend to rely on finds such as pottery and coins, but of course they can indicate activity at a location, but we have to be cautious on assuming it's occupied on a long-term basis. We have entrances. This applies to mainly camps. Those are some examples. Different styles of entrance are used in different periods. We have what we call morphology. So that's similar to entrances, but it assumes that the certain size or style of a fort or camp, not all Roman forts are playing card shape, but it assumes that the morphology, assumes that a detachment built several camps as part of a sequence, and that can indicate or help to indicate the date. We also have proximity, which happens a lot in Scotland, and that's where one site is assumed to be 1st century because it's located right next to another site that's probably 1st century. So usually if there's a camp and they build a fort next to it, we assume they have the same date. We really need to have more corroboration with finds or scientific dating to be certain of that. But it just gives you a brief overview of some of the issues we have. So we use all this data to tell the story of Roman Scotland. I was focusing on the positioning of fortifications in the landscape, the orientation, so which way they face, intervisibility, so can you see one site from another, and also the relationship with the river and road networks. And in the next few slides, I'm going to use Inchtuthil, the Leidri fortress, as the example to how we did some of the data. So I'm using that one as our sort of baseline because it's got lots of geophysical survey, excavation, LiDAR, lots of information about it. On the right here, we have the digital elevation model. That's what we use the mapping data to produce. It goes into the GIS as our sort of base map. So here we've got geophysical survey. This was done by David Woolscroft and Brigitte Hoffman. I also helped them in this. This was resistivity, that one. The ground resistance shows up the ditches here very nicely. along with several other features. There's a bit of a camp there and other things are happening. So once I narrowed down the sites to be Flavian, then have to accurately map them in the GIS. So that is plotting 120 sites. Not enough capacity to do that using GPS or global positioning. So it's measuring it, looking at maps and archaeological data that others have done. Not many of the sites, as I said, are covered by LiDAR. What we have got here, this is one that is covered by LiDAR. And we have the River Tay, which runs roughly around that course today. But using LiDAR and playing around in the GIS, we can see that Inchtoothel is on this peninsula. There's one of the ditches and the other. But you can see how wet and marshy this would have been with all the paleo channels there. So the Romans have picked the best location for their fortress. It's surrounded by wetlands, so it's not going to be easy to attack. It's quite high up, but it's also next to one of the biggest rivers in Britain. So I mentioned that the GIS uses temporal data. So we can add in things that have happened over the years to the site. This is, as I say, Inchtoothel has been excavated by Ian Richmond, St. Joseph, and we got this plan here of what the fortress looks like. It's a partial plan, but it was confirmed by Woolliscroft and Hoffman in their geophysics. You can then add that in to the digital elevation model in its exact positioning. So there's a lot more involved than I'm telling you here, and there's something like 500 points that have to be individually mapped, plotted, etc. This then allows you to extract the outline of the fortress, add in the contour lines, the modern landscape with the modern river, and it just helps to sort of look at why they're starting to build things in that location. So why was positioning important? Roman engineers were brilliant, conquered the Alps, did deserts, did Scotland. Very, very great military tacticians. And a lot of consideration went into where they constructed the fortifications. It had to be a secure site. It had to have fresh water nearby. They had to have self-defense. They used the natural landscape to defend their location. As you can see here at Bochastle, at Callander, in Stirlingshire, is between two rivers. There are actually a couple of Roman camps next to it as well. But you've got the secure side of the river. You've also got the hills providing some shelter. But if you can see here, Bochastle is situated between one valley, another valley, and a third valley. So strategically, they're able to control movement from the top valley and the bottom valley in towards the lowlands on that third one. We've also got here on the right, Carlop Spittal. Now, that's in the Scottish borders. It's quite a flat landscape. So what they're doing is building the fortification right next to the mountains because it's providing a layer of defense. You've got a few ravines there making it difficult to cross that. But again, it's about using the natural landscape to protect them. Very few fortifications are in locations where they could have been fired upon by the indigenous population. Such technology doesn't seem to have existed at that point in Scotland. But those two sites give you an idea of the extent they're going to build in locations that are secure. Positioning of the fortifications was really important. And again, we've got Crawford in, I think it's South Lanarkshire, near Dumfries and Galloway. This is where the main road into Scotland from Carlisle still runs up through there. Crawford Fort is here looking down southish, being able to see anybody encroaching from the south. But on the right here on this image, which is a slightly different one in the GIS, I've plotted in the indigenous sites. So we have one of the indigenous forts there that's probably occupied at the same time as the Roman fort. And the Roman fort there is guarding that access to and from that site, as well as the main north-south road into Scotland. So it's really about controlling both traffic and population, north-south, potentially east-west. Again, it's so they can control the population, it's so they can tax them, take whatever goods they want. And that's something that is reflected elsewhere in Scotland. So camps tend to need quite a large bit of land, and the army is great at adapting itself for that. Camps can cover tens of hectares. There's not always the space available where they're marching, particularly as you get further north into Scotland, into Aberdeenshire. We've got here on the left is Ray Dykes that I mentioned earlier, has the rock cut ditches on the southern side there, but it's got a hill within the boundaries of the Roman camp, and it's quite a big hill. You can't really see over it unless you actually climb it. But there's nowhere else for them to have constructed it, so they've adapted. That's why it's this peculiar shape. They've adapted and had to cut through the rock. On the right here is Cardine. It's on a bit of a peninsula, which you can see there. That may be down to some erosion. That may also have been the Romans themselves basically carving out the landscape to make it more defensive. But it's between two rivers. Particularly that one on the north is quite a large river, has tended to move around. But again, they're making use of that natural landscape to protect themselves. But we also see, by mapping all the sites together and looking at them all together, some rural areas such as Scottish borders, Murray, parts of Aberdeenshire, where there are less rivers, such as at Ray Dykes, they do construct the sites next to the big hills, as we saw in Carlops in the previous slide. But it provides, it says that a lack of defensive topography, but also the fertile landscape and the water resources are all taken into consideration, because you've got to look after your army. You've got to provide enough water and enough fertile land to gather your food. There was a study done a few years ago that reckoned per fort, there was something like a 500 square mile landscape where they would gather food from. Now, I don't know the ins and outs of that paper, but it gives you an idea that you've got a big area that you've got to bring food in to keep the troops going. And of course, the locals wouldn't have had much choice in that. Moving on to fort orientation, it's a very understudied area. So all fortresses, forts and camps have a front entrance. It's the sort of front gate. It may have been formal. There's some evidence for that in some forts, housesteads on Hadrian's Wall. But it's the entrance at the bottom here that you go in, takes you up this main road, and the first thing you face is the Principia. That's the headquarters building right at the back in that central room. Would have been the shrine to the gods, to the standards of the detachment. So it's quite important which way it faces. Camps are slightly different, but the principle's the same. We don't know the layout of all sites. We have to get a good idea of the picture, the layout, the positioning of the gates, the internal buildings. We piece all that together to work out which way sites are facing. So we don't always know the orientation. We've got a number of Roman period texts, military texts that tell us the gold standard of how to construct a fortification. They're written after the 1st century, but they imply that Roman forts should face the enemy, should face east, or the direction the army are going to march in. This being Scotland, they don't do any of that. Scotland standing on its own as usual. Let's not talk politics. Once we plot all this in to the GIS, we can start to do various types of analyses that tell us which way they're facing. This is in Tuthel. We know where the Principia is. We know where the gates are. So we know it faces southish there. Now, I did that analysis for, you can't do it for the towers because they have single entrance, same with the fortlets, but I did it for all the camps and the forts. So around 100 sites that I looked at the orientation. A lot of them we know, but sometimes, such as Abernethy here, we know it could face one of 4 directions. Ardagh 2, we know it could face one of 2 directions. Sometimes with camps like Auchenhold, we know which direction it's likely to face. Only 22% of Flavian sites that I looked at face either east, or if we fiddle a bit, northeast or southeast. So that's really statistically insignificant. In terms of facing the enemy, only 1% of the sites faced the enemy, hill forts usually. Even if we don't know which direction they face in and we include those sites, it goes up to 17%. But we have to bear in mind that all the indigenous sites that were within about a Roman mile of, or Roman mile and a bit of the Roman fortifications, they're very small. They're generally 0.4 hectares. They tend to be oval, so they're no threat whatsoever. So I think we can discount that they're facing the enemy. That doesn't seem to be taken into account. Are they facing the direction of marching, like the Roman writers tell us they should? No, we only have 2 Roman sites in Scotland in this period that appear to be facing along a Roman road. So again, we can probably dismiss that. So, like I say, it's not about what the Roman writers tell us about facing east or direction of marching. It's all about controlling movement through the landscape. This is the Roman army. They're massive. They're difficult, they're harassing, they build where they want, because if it's in a valley and you're moving through the landscape, you will pass by it. Just give you an idea of some of the other analysis we can do. This is Brocken Hill Fort, that's the River Clyde up here. Glasgow is just down here. We can do what's called a binary viewshed analysis, which basically says, if you're in that fort at Brocken Hill, your person height, which we assume in the software is about 1.5 meters, or if you're 8 meters high on a rampart, this shading, this red shading area is what you can see. Now, these blue dots are fords, so it looks like the fort is more concerned with traffic down in the Clyde Valley rather than the hills and hill forts nearby. There've been some tests done which indicate that the maximum visibility where you can make things out is about a 6-kilometer distance. So that's kind of what we're working on for this. You can do another analysis with this, which is intervisibility or lines of sight, basically what you can see. Now, Roman forts would have probably had 4 corner towers. So I've gone and plotted all those, hundreds of them. And then we can say, well, if you're on a rampart on this corner, what can you see from it? And this image here on the right shows that from the northern corner of the Leedry Fortress, you can see a tower, you can see a fort, you can probably see a fortlet and another tower. This builds on work on Roman signalling that was done by David Woolliscroft, published a book on Roman signalling in 2010. I thoroughly recommend it. David did his PhD, I think, in the 80s or 90s. I hope he's not listening. I'll get into trouble if I make him too old. But his PhD was based on going to each Roman site, putting a camera flash on a pole and flashing to someone at another Roman site who would say whether they could see it or not. Since then, of course, we've got GIS, and it's brilliant because we can do all that from the comfort of our own home. We don't need to go to fields and travel hundreds of miles and stick things on poles. We can do it. We can vary the height that you can see it. David's pole was between 8 and 10 meters, which he reckoned was the optimal height for a tower. But now we can vary that. We can do 5 meters. We can do 15 or 20 meters if we wanted. What that shows is that signalling is very interesting in Scotland. So I alluded earlier that I believe we have two different networks in Scotland. We have a series of towers in the Scottish borders. You can signal between them. I won't go into too much detail on this, but we've got the Roman fort at Tremontium, or Melrose in the borders, is located just here. It can signal to this tower on Eildon Hill. From Eildon Hill, you can signal to Oakwood, and there's actually a series of towers across the southern Scotland that it could signal to. However, these are all beyond the 6 kilometres for you to be able to make out what those signals are. So it's probably an early warning system that just flashing or waving flags is enough to alert people that there's danger or something happening. In the north of Scotland, in Perthshire, there's a much more complex system known as the Gask Ridge. It's a series of forts and camps, forts and towers and fortlets through what we call the Gask Ridge geological feature in the central area here. This is Ardagh Fort at the southern end. These are the towers, and you could signal between various ones of these, potentially as far as the Leedry Fortress at Inchtoothel. The forts have indicated 1st century occupation, possibly reoccupation in the 2nd century. Many of the towers have been excavated, but haven't yielded any datable evidence. There's about 1 or 2 fragments of pottery that could be 1st century. So we're assuming that everything is functioning and in existence and working at the same time. But by putting the analysis into the GIS, we can actually start to test that. So this is basically a signaling network diagram. All these square boxes and rounded corner boxes are Roman fortifications on the Gask Ridge. So you've got the towers, you've got Glenbank, which is the southernmost. And then from Glenbank, you can signal either to Ardagh or Woodley Tower. So all these dotted lines are where you can signal between the sites. As you see, the central area gets quite complicated. So from the south, you can signal up. Now this red, the ones in red, are the quickest line to signal to the Leedry Fortress at Inchtoothel. So if the purpose of this system was to signal to the Leedry Fortress, why do we have all these additional towers? Now, they may be watchtowers that are just out to keep an eye, but they are quite spaced quite close together, usually around half a kilometre between them. They're along a Roman road. There is a suggestion it may have been a secure supply line. Say it may have been a system of watchtowers. It may also have been a signaling system. What I think we're probably looking at are 2 systems. The red line is possibly the older system, and then at some point these towers have been abandoned or whatever, and a second system has been put in place. We need to do a bit more work on the ground to confirm that. It could be both from the 1st century. It could be a 1st century and a 2nd century system, particularly given that Stregeeth, Ardagh, the forts, and Bertha at the far end here have all yielded 2nd century evidence. So what I'm basically putting my neck out and saying, this is a lot more complicated than we previously thought. And using the GIS has kind of enabled us to see that. Just in the last couple of slides, I'm going to come on to looking at what the relationship is with rivers and Romans. So we've got 2 quotes here. They're both from Tacitus, his Annals, which he talks about the long baggage trains using the sea to basically campaign in, and how he uses that to get further inland in Germany, or the Roman army uses it, sorry. Also in Agricola, Tacitus writes that Agricola was going beyond the Bodotria, which we'll make an assumption that's the 4th, but he was using the fleet to reconnoiter the harbours and look at what's going on. So there is some indication in the Roman text that rivers are being used quite extensively by the army, the military. We know they're on the Danube, the Rhine. Why are they not doing this in Britain? We know they do it on the Thames. What about those big rivers in Scotland, the Firth of Forth in Edinburgh, which goes quite far up, the Firth of Tay as well, and also the coastline. So what evidence do we have for river usage in Scotland? There is no solid or recent evidence of any waterside structure in Scotland. People write about it, people assume it, such as at Maryport, people assume there's a Roman harbour. We don't have the evidence. We can make a guess, an educated guess, but we don't have archaeological evidence to confirm these things, except a couple of hints. So this on the left is the Newstead ore. It was found by James Curl in the excavations in the early 1900s at Newstead and Melrose. This is it. This is Tremontium, the hill of the Eildon Hill, the hill of the three peaks, I think it translates as. This ore potentially belonged to a flat barge. Now, this is one of the Zwammerdam vessels from the Netherlands, which were discovered in the mud in the 1950s, currently being preserved. They have a depth of around 1 meter, and they would have had an oar on the side to basically help direct it, and that's what the Newstead ore is speculated to be. So that Newstead Melrose is on the River Tweed. You of course got the mouth at Berwick, which is around, I think, about 25 to 30 miles away. But we've got evidence from this that the river was being used. Now, that could have been from a river crossing, but there is likely to have been a ford nearby. It seems more likely it was from a vessel that was being used to bring goods in from the sea, so whether at Berwick or slightly further inland, bringing them up to the fort at Tremontium. Tremontium is a very complex Roman site. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of activity, occupation. Over its period, there are 4 forts there. There are 9 camps in the surrounding area, potentially a Roman bridge, an amphitheatre. Animal husbandry seems to be going on. It's a very, very key site. So it seems like they may have been bringing goods in from the river. We've got 2 other pieces of evidence. We've got a 17th century account of a mole, which is part of a harbour that was found at Cramond, which is possibly a 2nd century, more likely to be a 3rd century site, may have had 1st century activity. That was recorded, but has since been destroyed by Second World War defences. It's been covered up. There's also a timber structure at Bertha, which is a Roman fort on the Tay. It's the highest tidal limit of the Tay. Again, goods, supplies, soldiers could have been shipped up the Tay, and there's some evidence that there may have been possibly a bridge, possibly some sort of harbour jetty structure. Again, antiquarian account, we've not been able to trace that in the archaeological record in recent years. So we just have to speculate about all that. So looking at sites in Scotland, there's a significant number of fortifications which are located near waterways. Almost all Roman fortifications, as an exception with some camps, tend to be either on the main river networks or on their tributaries. That's about 86% of the 120 or 100 odd Roman sites, because we take the towers out of the equation. It's important for them to be by rivers because it's a supply of fresh water, potentially food, which are essential to sustaining an invading force. But positioning sites on rivers would make them easy to locate if other soldiers, civilians start following the river valleys, they'll come to the forts. But as that quote in the Annals implied, rivers are a quick route to the interior. Particularly for an invading force which had not yet established their own network of roads. I should make it clear, that although rivers levels would have been higher in the Roman period, particularly in Scotland, a geological process called isostatic rebound means that levels in England were slightly lower, and in Scotland they were slightly higher because the country's tilting. I'm not suggesting that the army was traveling deep into the heart of Scotland by boat. Certainly they could have been following the rivers. They could get quite far up if they're using barges with a meter draft and other flat-bottomed vessels. But it does seem that the waters, the river network is important to the army. There's also, as you can see from the graph here, a statistically significant number of sites which were constructed near confluences, so where two rivers meet. It's quite interesting, particularly if forts are acting as supply bases along a river network. It also implies that they're controlling whoever is using the river access. The rivers, of course, are the sort of natural arterial routes. And if you control those, you can control who's using them. Again, tax them for goods, keep an eye on what they're up to, take what you want. Here are just a couple of examples. Glenlocher, which is the lower site here, is on the river. We've also got the road running nearby. The brown lines are contours, but the Roman road probably runs in this area. So you've got the fort guarding a river crossing. You've got several camps nearby. This again seems to be a bit of an important area. There is some suggestion, I don't personally go for it, but the first century invasion of Ireland was going to be launched from Dumfries and Galloway. So that's one of the reasons they're controlling the main rivers in that area, because they need that resource. We've got Malling Fort, which is up here in Stirlingshire. It's quite curious because, as you can see, there are no northeastern defences on that fort. Now, they have been looked for in geophysical survey. They could be under the lake levels. This is the Lake of Menteith, Scotland's second lake. But it could also be making use of the lake as a line of defense and bringing goods across in and then just shoring them straight within the fort. Again, lots of questions. We've still got to do a lot of work looking into this. Another couple of examples. Cargill in Perthshire is a fort here. It's on the river. It's potentially protecting this confluence. It has what we call an annex. Now, these are secure compounds that are attached to the fort. We don't know what their function was, but the speculation is that because it's next to the river here, they're bringing goods on the river and then landing them into the annex directly. And Stracathro here, again, it's a good example of making use of the natural landscape for defense. We've got the three rivers here. These two are quite big. We've also got a smaller river there, giving defense to the site, but also protecting it. It's also on a bit of a peninsula as well. So there may have been river access, but you can certainly come up rivers from Cargill and eventually you end up there. So just to kind of sum up, the approaches, analysis, conclusions that I've presented does really challenge a lot of what we assumed to know about the first century invasion of North Britain and the military strategy behind that. That's really been helped by being able to compile big data, do lots of fancy analysis instead of traditional approach, which has been to look at individual sites on their own. But it does remind us that we need to be cautious when looking at historical, literary, and archaeological evidence. It's very difficult to cross-reference these, but texts like the Agricola are biased. We've always made assumptions based on that. Sometimes that probably isn't quite right. Same with the Roman military textbooks that tell us how and where to build sites. They're not quite right when it comes to Scotland because we have to be different in Scotland. So the research sort of demonstrates that Fortification landscapes are rarely simple or straightforward. And in order to understand the role of fortifications in military strategy, we need to understand the relationship both with and within the wider landscape. And that's what I've tried to do. I tried to present the conclusion that the strategy in Scotland was not to restrict all movement through the wider landscape, because this would have been highly resource intensive and challenging in an area with so many glens, valleys, hills and mountains. It would have been impossible to police them all, but it would have been unlikely. The aim of the army was to control the main corridors of movement, usually in the vicinity of the fortifications. And by doing this, they would exert both visual control and authority over the indigenous population, and negate the need to control the entirety of the landscape in Scotland. So just before I finish, as I said at the start, if you want to learn more about Roman Scotland, you can get my first book. If you want to learn more about Hadrian's Wall, and why wouldn't you, because we're on top of it, I've got my second book. If you want the more academic book, Facing the Enemy is one to get. I have been told that if you sign up to BAR, the publisher's mailing list, you get 20% off, or you can use a library.